much. And thank you for having me. And sorry, I couldn't be there. Conditions would not allow us to do that, but maybe another time and we'll see you there. But I'm going to go directly into my presentation here. Let me just get it on full screen as well. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of an overview of how I'm applying the methodologies of these concepts in Manchester right now. But it's a concept I've been working on for many years, over 10 years, working with the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera and colleagues at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, where we were aware that there was a long-standing history of this idea of arte útil, or using art as a tool, or the idea that you would use art in general life processes in the wider economy and ecology of the world. And this really led to the idea to consolidate this in a kind of movement, or actually an online platform, which would consolidate all these ideas in one place. So we formed an association and created this online platform in which we could document all the case studies from around the world and gather them in one place. On this site, there are hundreds and hundreds of examples from around the world of art being deployed for practical social change. Artists and communities working together to use the competencies of art in order to make some kind of manifest change in their own environment, or in wider environments, or in a global environment. On the back of this, there's been a lot of publishing and education programs and manifestations of arte útil in many different places around the world. It's a kind of growing network of people. But as part of this, we have published a number of books, including What's the Use and the Constituent Museum, that being the idea of the museum being constructed by all the different constituents, the people who have a stake in that museum. And also the kind of Bible of the project, which is Towards a Lexicon of Usership by Stephen Wright, which documents the new terms and criticizes the old terms of art to move us away from the 200-year of modernity that we are now emerging from. And one of the key concepts in this book was the idea of the Museum 3.0. How we might manifest these ideas in the institution itself. So if you can imagine Museum 1.0 is perhaps the 19th century version, where people come into the museum, they see the art, and they go away somehow better for it. The Museum 2.0 is something perhaps more recent, where strategies of participation and engagement are used for people to engage with the art in the museum, but still the content of the museum is still determined by quite a small number of people, usually those who are experts or come from the realm of connoisseurship, etc. So the Museum 3.0 is one of emancipated usership. It's about trying to shape and bend the museum into a place where many different people, stakeholders, if you like, or users, can come and do what is relevant to them, to get what they want from an institution that makes a difference in their own lives. So really what we've been trying to do in Manchester is to kind of try this out on a large scale in two of the largest museums in the UK, with collections of about 60,000 works each. This is the Manchester Art Gallery in the centre of Manchester, and was originally founded in 1823 as the Royal Manchester Institution, as essentially an education centre for the working classes, but one in which art was central to it. And interestingly, when I discovered the original plans for the museum, on Latin on the cover were the words, "Nothing beautiful unless useful." So some kind of gratification there. I'm going to just show you some examples of projects which I think will illustrate this. In 2017, the Manchester Arena suffered the appalling incident of a terrorist bombing. And on the back of this, thousands and thousands of offerings and memorials were put in the town's centre square in St. Anne's Square. And the museum worked with the city council and many partners to then document and gather all this material together, because it becomes such an important, in a way, cultural icon within the city. and had meant so much to people, that we decided to create an archive of all this material that would then be stored in a specific room in the museum and then be used by people who had been affected by the bombing, to have some kind of solace in that community spirit, and in the use of the museum as a place of therapy. And this then expanded out to a network of cities and locations around the world who'd also suffered similar trauma. Tony Bruguera I have worked with for many, many years, and in 2019, we created the School of Integration as a response to the issues around migration that were very hot and still very hot at the moment. And the idea was, rather than teaching English culture to migrants in a city of 200 languages, why don't we teach all cultures to all people? So this was a school that ran for over 2 weeks within the museum, using the museum as a site where different communities from different cultural backgrounds could teach their culture to other people, with cooking, with history, with geopolitics, whatever it might be. And it was a sharing of people's cultures together, rather than a one-dimensional presentation of what English might be, and trying to convert people to some culture of which they were not necessarily part of. Another example of this in play at the moment at Manchester Art Gallery is the conversion of some of our gallery spaces into other functions. So this is the main ground floor gallery in the Manchester Art Gallery, and has now been redeveloped as a centre for the development of children preschool, working with health visitors and health professionals to develop new ways to develop children from the ages of 0 to 5 with their parents, to develop linguistic and motor skills, but using the collection. So rather than doing child development in the hospital or the doctor's surgery, they do it in the museum with the richness of our collections and the aesthetic environment of the museum. And this is proving to have much greater effect on the impact of children. A lot of this has a history in the city already, with, for example, the Ancoats Art Museum, created by Thomas Horsfall in the 1880s, which worked exactly along these lines, which was essentially about working in the slums of Manchester as it industrialized, and teaching children and families better ways of living through the mechanisms of art. A lot of this was founded on the teachings and writings of John Ruskin, who gave a lecture in Manchester Art Gallery in 1857 on the political economy of art, arguing that the role of art in society was not for its own sake, but for use to create better health for society and better living for society. What we're doing now is, at the Whitworth, is also translating this philosophy into the contemporary landscape of today. The Whitworth is my other gallery that I manage, and is situated amongst the complex migrant neighbourhoods of South Manchester. It's a grand edifice, a red brick building, rather intimidating, not necessarily one attuned to engagement, you might say. But slowly we've been adapting the building and opening it up and rediscovering its history as actually the Whitworth Institute and Park, which was designed exactly the same as Manchester Art Gallery, to use art to create better living, health and working conditions for the working classes of Manchester, with a park included. It was a combined park and art gallery, basically to create a better mind, body and spirit. So the first exhibition I did at the Whitworth in 2018-19 was Joy Forever, basically an illustrated lecture on John Ruskin's political economy, in which art played a central role in the development of society, including this wonderful example of him teaching his art students how to build a road at Oxford University in the 1880s, but the most beautiful road that would connect 2 villages to stop the spread of cholera. This was now reinvented for Whitworth Park as a new road building project with the communities around it to create an outdoor health centre, using nature, using food, using the aesthetics that art can bring to improve the lives of the people who live in the neighbourhoods around us. Equally, we have been encouraging people to come and use the museum for their own ends. The Reno was a nightclub in Moss Side at the center of the riots in the 1980s amongst the Afro-Caribbean communities of Moss Side, which then was demolished through regeneration. And we invited a group who'd been working on an archaeological dig of the nightclub to somehow give themselves some kind of agency and representation in the city, and produced an exhibition of the findings of the archaeological dig, and on the back of this, to allow them to tell their story that had previously been suppressed. Right up to date now, I'm going to introduce you to an exhibition that illustrates this as well, which is opening tomorrow night. And it's the work of Suzanne Lacey, who for many, many years has been a principal agent in the world of social practice. And in about 2017, I began a conversation with SF MoMA in San Francisco about how we would do a Suzanne Lacey exhibition, which is all about working with people. Their version, you might say, was quite a static retrospective, an artist who's been working for over 5 decades in this field. But we rather came up with Suzanne with the idea of using the exhibition as a manual which would affect change in the city. So the exhibition is called Suzanne Lacey, What Kind of City? A Manual for Social Change, and uses her existing projects as platforms for new projects that will implement policy change in the city. Oakland Projects was a project she did in Oakland in the Bay Area of the US in the 1990s, over 10 years, working with Black youth and police to improve conditions for young people and teach visual literacy and media literacy in order to give them some kind of political power and not to be the victims of violence and suppression by the police. This is now being reinvented in Manchester on the back of this work being presented, working with young people from the neighbourhoods around us to also teach them visual literacy and how they can use that as agency to get better life pathways. And this will also influence the education policy for the whole city. Another project was working with Suzanne and mill workers in the north of the city in an old industrial cotton mill. A cotton mill which was run essentially by 2 different cultures, the cultures of the traditional white working classes, as we might say, but also by the migrant labor force that came from South Asia. Through her work, by deep listening with these communities, created a project where the 2 traditions, the 2 cultures of these mill workers were brought together through singing. And this involved working with Sufi Muslim chanters and combining that with traditional English shape note singing and producing a choir that would combine these cultures together as a way and a means to community cohesion. On the back of this, a youth choir was now formed, and this will then be presented in the exhibition to develop more of these cultural hybrids within the city of Manchester. The other work we're showing as an illustrative tool is a project created recently in Northern Ireland by Suzanne, working with the people who lived along the Northern Ireland border, which had suddenly been exposed to new divisions through Brexit as a site of political disruption. And she worked with over 300 residents who lived along the border to ask questions about what borders mean, how we can construct new ways of living and working in this polarized landscape. On the back of this, they created a summit at Stormont, the government building, with a dinner in which voices were heard and listened to, and a yellow manifesto was produced to demand better ways of living along the border in the post-Brexit situation. This will also trigger new projects around Manchester, which look at the invisible borders in our city, around health, around education, around different communities, around wealth and inequalities on those fronts. And finally, at Manchester Art Gallery, Suzanne is building on a project she did back in the 1990s, working with cleaners of the gallery around issues of work and revisiting this with a new project, Uncertain Futures, campaigning for women over 50 in the city for better living conditions, health conditions, working rights, amongst a community of people who are suffering the most severe inequalities in the city today. This powerful group of over 14 women are devising a program across the city, but using the gallery as a central point in this, with meetings that have been held over the last 2 years on Zoom, looking at the intersections of race, migration, age, gender, disability, and class, and using the gallery itself and its collections to conduct a survey from women across the city, recording interviews, working with university researchers, and presenting these findings next year in March to the policymakers and decision makers of the city to demand for change for women in the future. And finally, I'm going to finish very quickly on this building, which is the third one, another museum under my jurisdiction, which was formerly a gallery of costume and is now being repurposed as a new kind of museum constructed solely alongside these methods. It's an empty Georgian house now, and what we are doing is redeveloping this, bending this into shape, working with the communities around it to decide what it will be. We don't know what it will be yet, but that uncertainty in the future is what's the most exciting about where we're going. Thank you.